The Diamond Zone was simultaneously claimed by the Orange Free State, the South African Republic, the Western Griqua under Nicolaus Waterboer, and Southern Swana chiefs. At a special hearing in October 1871, Robert W. Keat, then Lieutenant Governor of Natal, found in favor of Waterboer, but the British persuaded him to request protection against his Boer rivals, and the area was annexed as Griqualand West. The annexation of the diamond fields signaled a more progressive British policy under a Liberal ministry, but fell short of the ambitious Confederation policy pursued by Lord Carnarvon, the colonial secretary in Benjamin Disraeli's 1874 Conservative government. He sought to unite the republics and colonies into a self-governing federation in the British Empire, a concept inspired by Theophilus Shepstone, who, as Secretary for Native Affairs in Natal, urged a coherent regional policy with regard to African labor and administration. Carnarvon concentrated at first on persuading the Cape and the Free State to accept federation, but a conference in London in August 1876 revealed how unreceptive these parties were to the proposal. With his southern gambit frustrated, Carnarvon embarked on a northern strategy. The South African Republic, Transvaal, virtually bankrupt, had suffered military humiliation at the hands of the petty, and support for President Thomas F. Burgers had declined because of this. Carnarvon commissioned Shepstone to annex the Transvaal, and, after encountering only token resistance at the beginning of 1877, he proclaimed it a British colony a few months later. The new possession proved difficult to administer as empty coffers and insensitivity to Afrikaner resentments led to a clash over tax payments, and, under a triumvirate of Paul Kruger, Piet Joubert, and Marthinus Wessel Pretorius, the Transvaal Boers opted to fight for independence. British defeats, especially at Majuba in 1881, ended British insistence on the concept of confederation. By the London Convention of 1884, Republican self-government was restored, subject to an imprecise British suzerainty over external relations. Afrikaner and African politics in the Cape, as the diamond discoveries created more revenue that could be used to build railways and public works. Although by this time some 2/3 of the settler population spoke Dutch or Afrikaans, political power rested largely with an English-speaking elite of merchants, lawyers, and landholders. The conflict between Afrikaners and English speakers led to the establishment of the Afrikaner Bond in 1879. The bond initially represented poorer farmers and espoused an anti-British Pan-Africanism in the Cape and beyond. But after its reorganization a few years later under John Hendrik Hofmeyr, the group began to champion the Cape's commercial interests and acquired a new base of support, mainly wealthier farmers and urban professionals. When Hofmeyr threw his support behind Cecil Rhodes in 1890, he enabled Rhodes to become Prime Minister of the Cape. Their alliance stemmed from a mutual desire for northward economic expansion. A major cleavage, however, opened up between Bond politicians and the English-speaking voters, loosely defined as Cape Liberals. The latter, particularly those in constituencies in the Eastern Cape that had a significant percentage of black male voters, were tactically friendly to the small enfranchised stratum of fairly prosperous black peasants, whereas the Bond and most English-speaking white voters were hostile toward the black farmers growing cash crops and pursued more restrictive franchise qualifications. The number of blacks in the colony greatly increased between 1872 and 1894, as heretofore independent territories were annexed to the Cape. As black farmers became more prosperous, and as more blacks became literate clerks and teachers, many individuals qualified to vote. The rise of the Afrikaner Bond and new laws affecting franchise qualifications and taxes also stimulated more vigorous black participation in electoral politics after 1884. New political and educational bodies came into existence in the Eastern Cape, as did the first black newspapers and black-controlled churches. The period also witnessed the first political organizations among coloreds in the Cape and Indians in Natal and the Transvaal. Gold mining. Prospectors established in 1886 the existence of a belt of gold-bearing reefs 40 miles, 60 kilometers, wide centered on present-day Johannesburg. The rapid growth of the gold mining industry intensified processes started by the diamond boom, immigration, urbanization, capital investment, and labor migrancy. By 1899, the gold industry attracted investment worth £75 million, produced almost 3/10 of the world's gold, and employed more than 100,000 people, the overwhelming majority of them black migrant workers. The world's richest goldfield was also the most difficult to work. Although the gold ore was abundant, the layers of it ran extremely deep, and the ore contained little gold. To be profitable, gold mining had to be intensive and deep level, requiring large inputs of capital and technology. A group system, whereby more than 100 companies had been arranged into 9 holding companies, or groups, facilitated collusion between companies to reduce competition over labor and keep costs down. The gold mines rapidly established a pattern of labor recruitment, remuneration, and accommodation that left its stamp on subsequent social and economic relations in the country. White immigrant miners, because of their skills, scarcity, and political power, won relatively high wages. In contrast, the more numerous unskilled black migrants from throughout southern Africa, especially from present-day Mozambique, earned low pay, at century's end about 1/9 the wage of white miners. Migrant miners were housed in compounds, which facilitated their control and reduced overhead costs. The road to war. Even before the discovery of gold, the South African interior was an arena of tension and competition. Germany annexed Southwest Africa in 1884. The Transvaal claimed territory to its west. Britain countered by designating the territory the Bechuanaland Protectorate and then annexed it as the Crown Colony of British Bechuanaland. Rhodes secured concessionary rights to land north of the Limpopo River, founded the British South Africa Company, and in 1890 dispatched a pioneer column to occupy what became known as Rhodesia. While these forces jostled for position in the region at large, the domestic politics of the Transvaal became unsettled. Paul Kruger's government made strenuous efforts to accommodate the mining industry, but it was soon at loggerheads with Britain, the mine magnates, and the British and other non-Afrikaner outlander immigrants. British policymakers expressed concern about the Transvaal's potential as an independent actor, and deep-level mine owners chafed at mine bosses' corruption and inefficiency. The grievances of the Uitlanders, largely excluded from the vote, provided both cause and cover for a conspiracy between British officials and mining capitalists. An Uitlander uprising in Johannesburg was to be supported by an armed invasion from Bechuanaland, headed by Leander Starr Jameson, Rhodes's lieutenant, who would intervene to restore order. The plot was botched. The Uitlander Rising did not take place, but Jameson went ahead with his incursion in December 1895, and within days, he and his force had been rounded up. While Rhodes had to resign as Prime Minister of the Cape, British Colonial Secretary Joseph Chamberlain managed to conceal his complicity. The Jameson raid polarized Anglo-Boer sentiment in South Africa, simultaneously exacerbating Republican suspicions, Uitlander agitation, and imperial anxieties. In February 1898, Kruger was elected to a 4th term as president of the Transvaal. He entered a series of negotiations with Sir Alfred Milner, who became High Commissioner and Governor of the Cape in 1897, over the issue of the Uitlander franchise. Milner declared in private early in 1898 that war has got to come and adopted intransigent positions. The Cape government, headed by William P. Schreiner, attempted to mediate, as did Marthinus Stein, the president of Free State, even while he attached his cause to Kruger's. In September 1899, the 2 Boer republics gave an ultimatum to Britain, and, when it expired on October 11th, Boer forces invaded Natal. The South African War, 1899–1902. South African War, Boer troops lining up in battle against the British during the South African War, 1899–1902. While the government of Lord Salisbury in Britain went to war to secure its hegemony in southern Africa, the Boer republics did so to preserve their independence. The expensive and brutal colonial war lasted 2.5 years and pitted almost 500,000 imperial troops against 87,000 Republican burghers, Cape rebels, and foreign volunteers. The numerical weakness of the Boers was offset by their familiarity with the terrain, support from the Afrikaner populace, and the poor leadership and dated tactics of the British command. Although often styled a white man's war, both sides used blacks extensively as labor, and at least 10,000 blacks fought for the British. Boer Siege of Ladysmith. The Boer Siege of Ladysmith, now Mnambithi, 1900, during the South African War, 1899–1902. In the first phase of the war, Boer armies took the offensive and punished British forces at Colenso, Stormberg, and Magersfontein in December 1899, Black Week. During 1900, Britain rushed reinforcements to the front, relieved sieges at Ladysmith, now Mnambithi, Kimberley, and Mafeking, and took Bloemfontein, Johannesburg, and Pretoria. In the third phase, Boer commandos avoided conventional engagements in favor of guerrilla warfare. The British commander, Lord Kitchener, devised a scorched earth policy against the commandos and the rural population supporting them, in which he destroyed arms, blockaded the countryside, and placed the civilian population in concentration camps. Some 25,000 Afrikaner women and children died of disease and malnutrition in these camps, while 14,000 blacks died in separate camps. In Britain, the Liberal opposition vehemently objected to the government's methods for winning the war. Boer forces, which at the end consisted of about 20,000 exhausted and demoralized troops, sued for peace in May 1902. The Treaty of Vereeniging reflected the conclusive military victory of British power, but made a crucial concession. It promised that the question of granting the to natives blacks would be addressed only after self-government had been restored to the former Boer republics. The treaty thus allowed the white minority to decide the political fate of the black majority. Reconstruction, Union, and Segregation, 1902–1929. The Union of South Africa was born on May 31, 1910, created by a constitutional convention in Durban in 1908 and an Act of the British Parliament, 1909. The infant state owed its conception to centralizing and modernizing forces generated by mineral discoveries, and its character was shaped by 8 years of Reconstruction between 1902 and 1910. During that period, efficient administrative structures were created, and a relationship developed between Afrikaner politicians and mining capitalists that consolidated the economic dominance of gold. Reconstruction also ensured that settler minorities would prevail over the black majority. Black societies were policed and taxed more effectively, and the new constitution excluded blacks from political power. Racial segregation was further developed through policies proposed during Reconstruction and solidified after 1910. Both Afrikaner and black nationalism utilized new political vehicles. Syndicalist white workers and Afrikaner Republican diehards fought against employers and government, their clashes culminating in the Rand Revolt of 1922. Black protests against the new order ranged from genteel lobbying and passive resistance to armed rural revolt, strikes, and mass mobilization. Milner and Reconstruction. High Commissioner Milner transferred his headquarters from Cape Town to Pretoria in 1902. The move symbolized the centrality of the Transvaal to his mission of constructing a new order in South Africa. When Milner departed in 1905, his vision of a country politically dominated by English-speaking whites had failed. Schemes to flood the rural Transvaal with British settlers yielded only a trickle, and, worse yet, compulsory Anglicization of education only intensified feelings of Afrikaner nationalism. Opposition to Milnerism defined the emergent political groups led by former Boer generals Louis Botha, Jan Smuts, and JBM, Barry Hertzog. Milner had hoped to withhold self-rule from whites in South Africa until there are 3 men of British race to 2 of Dutch. But when Henry Campbell Bannerman's Liberal ministry granted responsible government to the former republics in 1907, Afrikaner parties won elections in the Transvaal. Yet, if Milner's political design failed to take shape, he did largely realize his blueprint for economic and social engineering. Served by a group of hand-picked young administrators, he made economic recovery a priority because it was imperative to restore the mines to profitability. He lowered rail rates and tariffs on imports and abolished the expensive concessions granted by the Kruger regime. Milner also made strenuous efforts to ensure cheap labor to the mines. To achieve this goal, he authorized the importation of some 60,000 Chinese indentured laborers when black migrants resisted wage cuts. Chinese miners, who would mostly return home by 1910, performed only certain tasks, but their employment set a precedent for a statutory color bar in the gold mines. Although this experiment provoked political outcries in the Transvaal and in Britain, it succeeded in undercutting the bargaining power of black workers. The value of gold production swelled from £16 million in 1904 to £27 million by 1907. The administration worked to remodel the Transvaal as a stable base for agricultural, industrial, and finance capital, spending some £16 million to return Afrikaners to their farms and equip them. It established a land bank, promoted scientific farming methods, and developed more efficient tax collection methods, which increased pressures on black peasants to work for white farmers. Especially on the Witwatersrand, the young administrators tackled town planning, public transport, housing, and sanitation, and in each of these spheres, a new urban geography proceeded from the principle of separating white and black workers. The South African Native Affairs Commission, SANAC, was appointed to provide comprehensive answers to the native question. Its report, 1905, proposed territorial separation of black and white land ownership, systematic urban segregation by the creation of black locations, the removal of black squatters from white farms and their replacement by wage laborers, and the segregation of blacks from whites in the political sphere. These, and other SANAC recommendations, provided the basis for laws passed between 1910 and 1936, Convention and Union. Concern in London over the electoral victory by the Afrikaner Party, Het Volk, evaporated as soon as it became clear that both Botha and Smuts understood the economic preeminence of mining capital. A policy of reconciliation between Africans and English-speaking whites was also promoted. A national convention, which met in Durban in 1908-09, drafted a constitution. Afrikaner leaders and Cape Premier John X. Merriman opted for a unitary state with Dutch and English as official languages and with parliamentary sovereignty. Executive authority was vested in a governor-general who would be advised by a cabinet from the governing party. Two entrenched clauses on language and franchise could be amended only by a two-thirds majority vote in Parliament. While Cape delegates favored a color-blind franchise, those from the Transvaal and Orange Free State demanded an exclusively white electorate. A compromise simply confirmed existing electoral arrangements. The former republics retained white male adult suffrage and did not consider female suffrage. White women finally won the right to vote in 1930. In 1910, 85% of Cape voters were white, 10% colored, and 5% black. Representation was further limited on racial lines. Even in the Cape, only whites could stand for Parliament. Black, colored, and Indian political responses. The South African War occurred at a time when many black communities suffered under great hardship. During the 1890s, drought and cattle disease, particularly rinderpest, impoverished pastoralists, while competition increased for black land and labor. During the war, most black South Africans identified with the British cause because imperial politicians assured them that equal laws, equal liberty for all races would prevail after a Boer defeat. However, the Treaty of Vereeniging, peace of, withdrew such promises, and a sense of betrayal stimulated political protest, especially among mission-educated blacks. Various organizations arose to counter the impending union of white-ruled provinces by ethnically and regionally uniting blacks. In response to the Constitutional Convention, blacks held their own, the South African Native Convention, in Bloemfontein. This provided an important step toward the formation of a permanent national black political organization. Such an organization was finally founded on January 8, 1912, when the South African Native National Congress, from 1923, the African National Congress, ANC, came into existence. Not all black protests occurred through the new middle-class organizations, however. Some black farmers from Natal refused to pay a poll tax in 1906, and their resistance developed into an armed uprising led by Bambatha, a Zulu chief. At the end of this reluctant rebellion, between 3,000 and 4,000 blacks had been killed and many thousands imprisoned. Parallel developments took place among politically conscious coloreds and Indians. Their first nationally based organization was the African Political, later People's Organization, founded in Cape Town in 1902. Under the presidency of Abdullah Abdurrahman, this body lobbied for colored rights and had links at times with other black political groups. Indians in the Transvaal, led by Mohandas K. Gandhi, also resisted discriminatory legislation. Gandhi spent the years 1893 to 1914 in South Africa as a legal agent for Indian merchants in Natal and the Transvaal. Between 1906 and 1909, in protest against a Transvaal registration law requiring Indians to carry passes, Gandhi first implemented the methods of satyagraha, nonviolent noncompliance, which he later used with great effect in India. Union and disunity. Supported by the majority party in each province and by the British government, Louis Botha formed the first Union government in May 1910. The Botha administration entered a period of continuous change and violent conflict as tensions arose from issues left unresolved by the Constitution, from rapid but uneven economic growth, and from the legacy of conquest and dispossession of the indigenous peoples. One source of conflict was the relationship between employers and organized white workers. The Chamber of Mines and Miners' trade unions on the Witwatersrand engaged in combat for a decade and a half. Whenever violent confrontations flared up, as they did in 1907, 1913, and 1914, the government deployed troops to end the strikes. White workers suspended strike action during World War I, but militancy returned in 1919, this time fueled by inflation. The Chamber of Mines announced in December 1921 that because of rising costs and a falling gold price, it planned on replacing semi-skilled white workers with lower-paid blacks. A miners' protest stoppage in January 1922 became a general strike, and in March it developed into an armed rising, with strikers organized as commandos. John Smuts, Prime Minister since Botha's death in 1919, used artillery and aircraft to crush what became known as the Rand Revolt at a cost of some 200 lives. This intense conflict between white unions and employers ended with the passage of the Industrial Conciliation Act in 1924, which set up new state structures for regulating industrial conflicts. Black workers also engaged in sporadic strikes before, during, and after World War I, giving rise to the first black trade unions. More than 70,000 African gold miners halted production for a week when they struck for higher wages in February 1920. Soldiers and police broke the strike, but not before 11 miners died and more than 100 were injured. This strike was part of a wave of protest in several cities as inflation eroded. The real wages of black workers. Afrikaner rebellion and nationalism. When Britain declared war on Germany in 1914, South Africa's Dominion status meant that it was automatically at war, and its troops mobilized to invade German Southwest Africa. This sparked a rebellion led by former Boer generals, who held high-ranking positions as officers in the Union Defense Force. Some 10,000 soldiers, mainly poverty-stricken rural Afrikaners, joined the rising. The government used 32,000 troops to suppress it, and more than 300 men lost their lives in the fighting. The rebellion, though, was an atypical episode in the rise of Afrikaner nationalism as a political force. More telling responses came from those Afrikaners who had been profoundly affected by economic change, war, and Reconstruction. After 1902, thousands of landless families streamed into the cities, indicating the extent to which the pre-war rural social order had crumbled. One response to the threat of further disintegration was a second language movement spearheaded by teachers, clergymen, journalists, and lawyers who felt deeply threatened by the cultural dominance of English speakers. It succeeded in its immediate aim when Afrikaans replaced Dutch as an official language in 1925. J.B.M. Hertzog founded the National Party in 1914, with support mainly from poor whites and militant intellectuals. The general election of 1915 gave the National Party 30% of the vote, with Afrikaners deserting the South African Party, led by Botha and Smuts. Herzog's party won a majority of both seats and votes in 1920 on a platform of republicanism and separate school systems for Africans and English-speaking whites. The June 1924 election propelled Herzog to the position of prime minister through a coalition between the National and Labour parties known as the Pact Government. Segregation of South Africa. In the first 2 decades of the Union, segregation became a distinctive feature of South African political, social, and economic life, as whites addressed the native question. Blacks were retribalized, and their ethnic differences highlighted. New statutes provided for racial separation in industrial, territorial, administrative, and residential spheres. This barrage of legislation was partly the product of reactionary attitudes inherited from the past, and partly an effort to regulate class and race relations during a period of rapid industrialization when the black population was growing steadily. The 1911 Mines and Works Act and its 1926 successor reserved certain jobs in mining and the railways for white workers. The Natives' Land Act of 1913 defined less than 1/10 of South Africa as black reserves and prohibited any purchase or lease of land by blacks outside the reserves. The law also restricted the terms of tenure under which blacks could live on white-owned farms. The Native Urban Areas Act of 1923 segregated urban residential space and created influx controls to reduce access to cities by blacks. Herzog proposed increasing the reserve areas and removing black voters in the Cape from the common roll in 1926, aims that were finally realized through the Representation of Natives Act, 1936. Blacks now voted on a separate roll to elect 3 white representatives to the House of Assembly. The Pact years, 1924-33. Herzog's Pact government strengthened South Africa's autonomy, aided local capital, and protected white workers against black competition. Herzog also played a leading role at the Imperial Conference in London that issued the Balfour Report, 1926, establishing autonomy in foreign affairs for the Dominions. When he returned from Britain, Herzog turned his attention to creating the symbols of nationalism, flag and anthem. Economic nationalism included protective tariffs for local industry, subsidies to facilitate agricultural exports, and a state-run iron and steel industry. White trade unions grew more bureaucratic and less militant, although their members enjoyed at best modest material gains. Unskilled and non-unionized whites, who received support through sheltered employment in the public sector and through prescribed minimum wages in the private sector, gained more directly. Although the overall level of white poverty remained high, through these policies, the manufacturing sector absorbed white labor nearly twice as fast as black. Blacks gained little during this period and continued to lose earlier benefits. For them, segregation meant restricted mobility, diminished opportunities, more stringent controls, and a general sense of exclusion. Economic conditions in the reserves continued to deteriorate. The terms of tenancy became more onerous on white-owned farms, and the urban slums provided a harsh alternative for those who left the land. The first mass-based black political organization, the Industrial and Commercial Workers Union, ICU, flourished in response to deteriorating conditions. Until 1926, the ICU was a Cape-based organization with black and some colored members drawn mainly from urban areas. As a broadly based vehicle of rural protest, it had many thousands of supporters among black tenants on white farms. The ICU linked innumerable local rural grievances with a generalized call for land and liberation, but by 1929 its influence had declined. However, other organizations built on its base. The Communist Party of South Africa, CPSA, founded in 1921, was at first active almost solely within white trade unions, but from 1925 it recruited black members more energetically, and in 1928-29 it called for black majority rule and closer cooperation with the ANC. Its connection to the ANC occurred most prominently with Josiah Gumede, President 1927-30, whose political views moved leftward in the late 1920s. This led to a split in the ANC in 1930, as the more moderate members expelled the more radical ones. The 1929 general election reflected the political challenges to white supremacy. For the first time since Union, questions of native policy dominated white electoral politics. Afrikaner nationalists made black peril and communist menace their rallying cries. It was not to be the last such occasion. Colin J. Bundy, Julian R.D. Cobbing, the Apartheid years, the intensification of apartheid in the 1930s. Although Hertzog's National Party held a majority of the seats in the House of Assembly and dominated the South African cabinet in the early 1930s, its mismanagement of problems created by the Great Depression led him to form a coalition with his rival Smuts in 1933. Smuts was the leader of the South African Party, whose support came from the major industrialists and which was the party of most of the English-speaking whites, who made up less than half of the white population. In contrast, the National Party derived its main support from Afrikaner farmers and intellectuals. By 1934, the two organizations had merged to form the United Party, with Hertzog as prime minister and Smuts his deputy. The two parties and the two leaders had a common interest in favoring the enfranchised population, nearly all of whom were white, over the unenfranchised, all of whom were black. They agreed to provide massive support for white farmers, to assist poor whites by providing them with jobs protected from black competition, and to curb the movement of blacks from the reserves into the towns. Meanwhile, National Party member Daniel F. Malan disagreed with the merger of the parties and chose to keep the National Party functioning. The earnings from South Africa's gold exports increased sharply after Britain and the United States abandoned the gold standard in the early 1930s. White farmers prospered, new secondary industries were established, and South Africans of all races continued to flock to the towns. South Africa changed from a predominantly rural country that exported raw materials and imported manufactured consumer goods into a country with a diverse economy. Although the standard of living for most whites improved greatly from this expansion, the lives of coloreds, blacks, and Indians were hardly affected. The government did add some land to the reserves in 1936, but it never exceeded 13% of the area of the country. Until the end of apartheid, almost 9/10 of South Africa, including the best land for agriculture and the bulk of the mineral deposits, belonged exclusively to whites. Unsurprisingly, conditions on the native reserves became progressively worse through overpopulation and soil erosion. The government attempted to resolve these problems through a series of programs called betterment schemes, which involved keeping tight control over land use in the reserves, often drastically culling cattle, and enforcing the building of contour ridges to reduce soil erosion. Overcrowding in the reserves made it necessary for a high proportion of the men to work for wages elsewhere, on white farms or in the towns, where they lived in a hostile world. Black and colored farm laborers, scattered in small groups throughout the agricultural areas, were isolated, and in the towns life was insecure and wages low. In the gold mining industry, the real wages of blacks declined by about 1/7 between 1911 and 1941. White miners received 12 times the salary of blacks. Education for blacks was left largely to Christian missions, whose resources, even when augmented by small government grants, enabled them to enroll only a small proportion of the black population. Missionaries did, however, run numerous schools, including some excellent high schools that took a few pupils through to the university level. And missionaries were the dominant influence at the South African Native College at Fort Hare, founded 1916, which included degree courses. These institutions educated a small but increasing number of blacks, who secured teaching jobs and positions in the lower reaches of the civil service or functioned as clergy, especially in the independent churches that had broken away from mainstream white churches. Educated blacks were frustrated by the fact that whites did not treat them as equals, and some of them took part in opposition politics in the ANC. However, the ANC and two parallel movements, the African Political Organization, a colored group, and the South African Indian Congress, had little popular support and exerted little influence during this period. Their leaders were mission-educated men who had liberal goals and used strictly constitutional methods, such as petitions to the authorities. The radical African ICU had collapsed by 1930, and the CPSA made little headway among blacks. World War II. When Britain declared war on Germany on September 3, 1939, the United Party split. Hertzog wanted South Africa to remain neutral, but Smuts opted for joining the British war effort. Smuts's faction narrowly won the crucial parliamentary debate, and Hertzog and his followers left the party, many rejoining the National Party faction Malan had maintained since 1934. Smuts then became the prime minister, and South Africa declared war on Germany. South Africa made significant contributions to the Allied war effort. Some 135,000 white South Africans fought in the East and North African and Italian campaigns, and 70,000 blacks and coloreds served as laborers and transport drivers. South African platinum, uranium, and steel became valuable resources, and, during the period that the Mediterranean Sea was closed to the Allies, Durban and Cape Town provisioned a vast number of ships en route from Britain to the Suez. The war proved to be an economic stimulant for South Africa, although wartime inflation and lagging wages contributed to social protests and strikes after the end of the war. Driven by reduced imports, the manufacturing and service industries expanded rapidly, and the flow of blacks to the towns became a flood. By the war's end, more blacks than whites lived in the towns. They set up vast squatter camps on the outskirts of the cities and improvised shelters from whatever materials they could find. They also began to flex their political muscles. Blacks boycotted a Witwatersrand bus company that tried to raise fares. They formed trade unions, and in 1946, more than 60,000 black gold miners went on strike for higher wages and improved living conditions. Although the 1946 strike was brutally suppressed by the government, white intellectuals did propose a series of reforms within the segregation framework. The government and private industry made a few concessions, such as easing the industrial color bar, increasing black wages, and relaxing the pass laws, which restricted the right of blacks to live and work in white areas. The government, however, failed to discuss these problems with black representatives. Afrikaners felt threatened by the concessions given to blacks and created a series of ethnic organizations to promote their interests, including an economic association, a federation of Africans' cultural associations, and the Afrikaner Broederbond, a secret society of Afrikaner cultural leaders. During the war, many Afrikaners welcomed the early German victories, and some of them even committed acts of sabotage. The United Party, which had won the general election in 1943 by a large majority, approached the 1948 election complacently. While the party appeared to take an ambiguous position on race relations, Malan's National Party took an unequivocally pro-white stance. The National Party claimed that the government's weakness threatened white supremacy and produced a statement that used the word apartheid to describe a program of tightened segregation and discrimination. With the support of a tiny fringe group, the National Party won the election by a narrow margin. The National Party and apartheid. After its victory, the National Party rapidly consolidated its control over the state and in subsequent years won a series of elections with increased majorities. Parliament removed colored voters from the common voters' rolls in 1956. By 1969, the electorate was exclusively white. Indians never had any parliamentary representation, and the seats for white representatives of blacks and coloreds had been abolished. One plank of the National Party platform was for South Africa to become a republic, preferably outside the Commonwealth. The issue was presented to white voters in 1960 as a way to bring about white unity, especially because of concern with the problems that the Belgian Congo was then experiencing as it became independent. By a simple majority, the voters approved the republic status. The government structure would change only slightly. The Governor-General would be replaced by a state president, who would be chosen by Parliament. At a meeting in London in March 1961, South Africa had hoped to retain its Commonwealth status, but when other members criticized it over its apartheid policies, it withdrew from the organization, and on May 31, 1961, became the Republic of South Africa. The government vigorously furthered its political goals by making it compulsory for white children to attend schools that were conducted in their home language, either Afrikaans or English, except for the few who went to private schools. It advanced Afrikaners to top positions in the civil service, army, and police, and in such state corporations as the South African Broadcasting Corporation. It also awarded official contracts to Afrikaner banks and insurance companies. These methods raised the living standard of Afrikaners closer to that of English-speaking white South Africans. Following a recession in the early 1960s, the economy grew rapidly until the late 1970s. By that time, owing to the efforts of public and private enterprise, South Africa had developed a modern infrastructure by far the most advanced in Africa. It possessed efficient financial institutions, a national network of roads and railways, modernized port facilities in Cape Town and Durban, long-established mining operations producing a wealth of diamonds, gold, and coal, and a range of industries. De Beers Consolidated Mines and the Anglo-American Corporation of South Africa, founded by Ernest Oppenheimer in 1917, dominated the private sector, forming the core of one of the world's most powerful networks of mining, industrial, and financial companies, and employing some 800,000 workers on 6 continents. State corporations, parastatals, controlled industries vital to national security. South African Coal, Oil, and Gas Corporation, Sasol, was established in 1950 to make South Africa self-sufficient in petroleum resources by converting coal to gasoline and diesel fuel. After the United Nations, UN, placed a ban on arms exports to South Africa in 1964, Armaments Corporation of South Africa, Armscor, was created to produce high-quality military equipment. The man who played a major part in transforming apartheid from an election slogan into practice was Hendrik F. Verwoerd. Born in the Netherlands, Verwoerd immigrated with his parents to South Africa when he was a child. He became Minister of Native Affairs in 1950 and was Prime Minister from 1958 until 1966, when Dimitri Tsifendas, a colored man, assassinated him in Parliament. Tsifendas was judged to be insane and was confined to a mental institution after the murder. Verwoerd's successor, B.J. Vorster, had been Minister of Justice, Police and Prisons, and he shared Verwoerd's philosophy of white supremacy. In Verwoerd's vision, South Africa's population contained 4 distinct racial groups: white, black, colored, and Asian, each with an inherent culture. Because whites were the civilized group, they were entitled to control the state. The all-white parliament passed many laws to legalize and institutionalize the apartheid system. The Population Registration Act, 1950, classified every South African by race. The Prohibition of Mixed Marriages Act, 1949, and the Immorality Act, 1950, prohibited interracial marriage or sex. The Suppression of Communism Act, 1950, defined communism and its aims broadly to include any opposition to the government and empowered the government to detain anyone it thought might further communist aims. The Indemnity Act, 1961, made it legal for police officers to commit acts of violence, to torture, or to kill in the pursuit of official duties. Later laws gave the police the right to arrest and detain people without trial and to deny them access to their families or lawyers. Other laws and regulations, collectively known as petty apartheid, segregated South Africans in every sphere of life. In buses, taxis, and hearses, in cinemas, restaurants, and hotels, in trains and railway waiting, rooms, and in access to beaches. When a court declared that separate amenities should be equal, Parliament passed a special law to override it. Grand apartheid, in contrast, is related to the physical separation of the racial groups in the cities and countryside. Under the Group Areas Act, 1950, the cities and towns of South Africa were divided into segregated residential and business areas. Thousands of coloreds, blacks, and Indians were removed from areas classified for white occupation. Blacks were treated like tribal people and were required to live on reserves under hereditary chiefs, except when they worked temporarily in white towns or on white farms. The government began to consolidate the scattered reserves into 8, eventually 10, distinct territories, designating each of them as the homeland, or Bantustan, of a specific black ethnic community. The government manipulated homeland politics so that compliant chiefs controlled the administrations of most of those territories. Arguing that Bantustans matched the decolonization process then taking place in tropical Africa, the government devolved powers onto those administrations and eventually encouraged them to become independent. Between 1976 and 1981-4 accepted independence, Transkei, Bophuthatswana, Venda, and Ciskei, though none was ever recognized by a foreign government. Like the other homelands, however, they were economic backwaters, dependent on subsidies from Pretoria. Conditions in the homelands continued to deteriorate, partly because they had to accommodate vast numbers of people with minimal resources. Many people found their way to the towns, but the government, attempting to reverse this flood, strengthened the laws by making it illegal for blacks to be in a town for more than 72 hours at a time without a job in a white home or business. A particularly brutal series of forced removals were conducted from the 1960s to the early 80s, in which more than 3.5 million blacks were taken from towns and white rural areas, including lands they had occupied for generations, and dumped into the reserves, sometimes in the middle of winter and without any facilities.